Hello everybody, welcome to Alterations of the GU System. This is recording number 1. This is going to be a fairly brief review, hopefully, of the A and P of the GU system. So if you're watching this and you don't feel like you need it, please stop watching this. It will be here for you if you get involved and find that you do need a review. You can just pop back in and find the part you need to review. So going forward, first things first, the functions of the urinary system. Our urinary system helps regulate our fluid balance. It does this through filtration, reabsorption, and excretion. The kidneys also regulate blood pressure by excreting the enzyme renin. That should be a familiar term if you see it on the screen there, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. I think Krista went over that. The kidneys also help regulate electrolyte balance through, again, filtration and reabsorption of electrolytes and water, H2O. The urinary system helps regulate acid-base balance, which we're going to go into, through secretion of hydrogen ions into urine, and therefore excretion. Filters/removes toxins and waste. About 200 liters of fluid is filtered by the kidneys every 24 hours, which is like a lot if you ask me. Only about 1.5 to 2 liters are actually excreted as urine. And then finally, the kidneys also produce erythropoietin. So this is a hormone that aids in the production of red blood cells. So kidneys are important. Brief overview of the components of the urinary system. We have the kidneys. They are our red bean-shaped organs. They lie behind the abdominal peritoneum and against the deep muscles of the back. They are level with about the 12th thoracic and 3rd lumbar vertebrae. Our ureter is connected from each kidney to the bladder, and it carries urinary waste from the kidneys to the bladder. The bladder, of course, is a sac of smooth muscle which holds urine, and the urethra connects the bladder to the external urethral sphincter. In women, it's only about 1 to 1.5 inches long. In men, it is 7 to 8 inches long. And then we're going to watch this neat little video. I love my videos, you guys know that. This is, again, just a overview of part 1 of the kidneys. There are 2 videos here, so they're about 10 minutes each. If you don't need them, feel free to fast forward, and I'll see you in 10 minutes.
We've been spending a lot of time lately talking about eating and digesting and metabolizing food. And those are some of my favorite things in the world. It's been a really great time. But as with all good parties or brunch buffets, in the end, we're left with a mess. And I'm not talking about spilled beer and Dorito crumbs. I'm talking about toxic levels of garbage that need to be cleaned up before they kill you. In your body, a lot of the cleanup that comes after metabolism is handled by the liver, which plays a tremendous role in directing dead cells and leftover chemicals to the digestive and urinary systems. But your liver can't actually escort waste out of your person. Your lungs can lend a hand exhaling carbon dioxide, and of course your colon will eventually poop out unusable stuff and old cell parts. But much of your chemical waste still needs to be sorted and disposed of, so one system steps in to bat cleanup. And that is your urinary system. This system, and specifically your kidneys, does all sorts of important homeostatic stuff like regulating your water volume, ion salt concentrations, and pH levels, and influencing your red blood cell production and blood pressure. But its main purpose, what we're going to be focusing on for the next 2 lessons, is how it filters toxic leftovers from your blood, like nitrogenous waste made by metabolizing protein, and ferries it out of the body. And spoiler alert, this all involves the how and the why and the what of your pee. Now, you probably know that kidneys are filters, and you may imagine them as sieves that strain out the bad stuff, leaving it sitting like a hairball at the bottom of the bathtub. But that is, in fact, kind of the opposite of what you should be thinking. Most of what's in your blood is totally removed by the kidneys. Then your body pulls back what it wants to hold on to before the rest is sent on a one-way trip to the bladder. It's kind of like this. You don't clean out your fridge by just taking out the rotten fruit and fuzzy leftovers. Instead, you got to take everything out and put it on the counter and then sort through what goes back into the fridge and what goes in the trash. That's how your urinary system cleans you up, and it is really good at its job. So this morning, I decided to go the healthy route, and instead of eating my normal breakfast of nothing, I had a big 32-ounce protein smoothie. My digestive system did its thing, and all the protein was hydrolyzed into amino acids, which were absorbed by my blood and sent all over my body to build and repair cells. It's a beautiful thing, but not without consequence, because metabolizing nutrients, especially protein, makes a mess. You may remember that amino acids are unique in that they have nitrogen in their amine groups, and because we can't store amino acids, extra ones get processed into storable carbs or fats. The amine group isn't used in those storage molecules, so it's converted to NH3, or ammonia, which happens to be toxic. So the liver converts the ammonia into a less toxic compound, urea, which our kidneys filter out into our pee. Once out of the body, urea can degrade back into ammonia, which is why dirty pee-soaked toilets and cat litter boxes smell like ammonia. Now, this business of taking out the nitrogenous trash is one of the urinary system's biggest jobs. Its other major duty is to regulate the balance of salt and water in your blood, and both of these tasks are processed in the whole system of tubes that is your urinary system. So let's take a look at some basic pee-making anatomy. Your kidneys are a pair of dark red, fist-sized, bean-shaped organs that sit on each side of your spine against the posterior body wall. Kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means they lie between the dorsal wall and the peritoneum, the membrane that surrounds the abdominal cavity, rather than inside the cavity itself, like your intestines and stomach do. Each kidney has 3 distinct layers, beginning with the outermost cortex. Beneath that is the medulla, a set of cone-shaped masses of tissue that secrete urine into tiny sac-like tubules. And finally, the innermost layer is the renal pelvis, a funnel-shaped tube surrounded by smooth muscle that uses peristalsis to move urine out of the kidney into the ureter and into the bladder. Because the kidney's main job is to continuously filter blood, they end up seeing a lot of it. In fact, at any given moment, they hold over 20% of your total blood volume. Oxygenated blood enters the kidney through the large renal arteries, which deliver nearly a quarter of all blood pumped through the heart every minute. That means your kidneys filter about 120 to 140 liters of blood every day. As they enter the kidneys, renal arteries branch many times, ending in tons of little capillary groups. So a kidney isn't just one big filter. Instead, each one is made up of about 1 million twisty microscopic filtering units called nephrons. Structurally and functionally, nephrons are where the real business of blood processing, which like pee making, begins in 3 steps: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Each nephron consists of a round renal corpuscle that resides up in the cortex, followed by a long and winding renal tubule that loops around between the cortex and the medulla. The outer part of the corpuscle is a cup-shaped feature called the glomerular capsule, because inside it there's a whole tangle of capillaries called the glomerulus. That's from the Latin word for ball of yarn, which is pretty much what it looks like. And the endothelium of these capillaries is very porous, so they allow lots of fluid, waste products, ions, glucose, and amino acids to pass from the blood into the capsule. But they block out bigger molecules like blood cells and proteins, so they stay in the blood and exit through the peritubular capillaries, also known as the vasa recta. Now, all the stuff that gets squeezed out of the blood into the glomerulus is called filtrate, which is then sent along the elaborately twisting 3-centimeter long renal tubule. Even though it looks like just a tube, it actually has 3 major parts, some of which are permeable to certain substances but not others. First is the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, which is about as convoluted looking as its name suggests. Then the tube drops into a dramatic hairpin turn called the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle, a term that I like better personally. And finally, it ends in the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, which empties into a collecting duct. All this twisting might make the tubule look like super inefficient, but it actually serves an important purpose, as you might expect. Just like with your small intestines, the long, curly shape of the nephron provides more time and space for it to reabsorb whatever usable stuff it can. And this meandering path also allows the parts of the tubule that are toward the end to have an effect on processes that take place closer to the beginning as they pass each other. Because a lot of the stuff that winds up in the tube are valuable commodities, like ions and glucose and water, and we don't want to just pee all of them out if we can help it. So let's trace the whole process, starting at the top with the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT. The walls here are made of cuboidal epithelial cells with big ol' mitochondria that make ATP to power pumps that pull lots of sodium ions from the filtrate using active transport. These cells also are covered in microvilli that increase their surface area and help reabsorb much of the good stuff from the filtrate back into the blood. The remaining filtrate passes from the PCT into the loop of Henle, which starts in the cortex, then dips into the medulla before coming back into the cortex. And the form of this loop is key to its function, because its primary task is to drive the reabsorption of of water by creating a salt concentration gradient in the tissue of the medulla. It does this mainly by actively pumping out salts in the ascending limb. This creates some very salty interstitial fluid in the medulla, so when new filtrate comes down the descending loop in front of it, water passively flows out and into the super salty interstitial space. Since most of this water is picked up by the blood pretty quickly, the saltiness of the interstitial space doesn't get diluted, so it can keep drawing water out of the next batch of filtrate in the descending limb. Needless to say, this is super important, because if we peed out all the water that went into our kidneys, we would die of dehydration really quick. But even after all that, we are still only 2/3 of the way through the process. As we move out of the loop of Henle into the distal convoluted tubule and onto the collecting duct, the remaining filtrate is now officially urine. But there's one more component that we have to squeeze the most out of before we excrete the stuff: urea. Even though we think of urea as a waste product, just one more part of that protein shake that has to be dumped, the kidneys actually need it. They use it to ramp up the concentration gradient earlier in the process, making the medulla even saltier for the filtrate that's back there going through the ascending limbs. When the final steps, after the filtrate leaves the DCT, it enters the collecting duct, which runs back into the medulla. And while the salt passively draws even more water out of the collecting duct, some urea passively leaves the urine as well, making the medulla even more salty, and in turn more effective at drawing out water from the ascending limb a few steps back. So there's essentially a traveling pool of urea that escapes the urine, finds its way back into the loop of Henle, and then runs the whole course again back to the collecting duct, an ammonia-scented cycle called urea recycling. Now all that's left is a kind of last call to selectively sneak out any extra waste like hydrogen, potassium, and certain organic acids and bases using active transport. This is called tubular secretion, and it transports only select kinds of waste that have already made their way into the blood that's in the peritubular capillaries ready to leave the kidneys. This stuff is kind of like emptying your pockets of any last wads of tissue or crumpled receipts as you're walking a bag of trash to the curb. And that's how your kidneys clean up the mess left over from the giant party that is you metabolizing food. So if you thought that your kidneys were just a kind of fine mesh that filtered out bad stuff, now you know that that's not true. If you thought your urinary system was basically a matter of water goes in, pee goes out, that's definitely not true. And if you thought we were done talking about your urine, that is also not true, because next time we're going to be learning how your body regulates what's absorbed and what's excreted, and we'll find out what can happen when that regulation goes awry. But for now, you learned the anatomy of your urinary system and how your...
Okay, so you guys know he's like my favorite. He's my spirit animal. I talk just as fast as him, so I apologize. So that was part 1 of the urinary system. We're going to go on to part 2, which is just as riveting, I promise. And I don't know why these are all of a sudden so small on my screen. I made them bigger, and now they're back to being small. So when I post this, I will make sure that when I post the PowerPoint on Moodle, I'll make sure that these videos are actually the correct size. So sorry about that. So here we go, part 2.
It has filled countless diapers, caused discomfort for any number of airline passengers, and it totally ruined the dude's rug, which really tied the room together, man. Anatomists call it micturition, and I don't know why, because the rest of us call it urination, which seems like a fine word. All mammals and most animals urinate to remove toxins and to help maintain water volume homeostasis, or blood pressure. And while some of us spray it around to attract mates or mark territory or deter predators, as far as I know, only humans actually study pee. In fact, we've been doing it for thousands of years. Even before Hippocrates extolled the diagnostic virtues of pee sniffing, early Sumerian and Babylonian physicians were making urine-related observations. Medieval doctors as well diagnosed diseases based on smelling, inspecting, even tasting urine samples, and although they were often totally off base, which makes me feel bad for those guys who sipped urine for no reason, they were kind of onto something. Today, urological tests can help detect a lot of ailments based on the color, the smell, the clarity, and chemical composition of a sample. Freshly peed urine is usually around 95% water, slightly acidic with a pH of around 6, a little bit aromatic, and usually somewhere between clear and dark yellow in color, depending on your level of hydration. Urine also contains over 3,000 different chemical compounds, and their varying levels of concentration can tell us a lot about what's going on in the body. For example, if you give me a urine sample, I will have no idea what to do with it, but if you give it to a doctor and they can see that it's cloudy with white blood cells, that's a good sign you've got a urinary tract infection. If it smells sweet and contains a lot of glucose, you might have diabetes. If it looks pink, then unless you've recently eaten beets, you probably have internal bleeding somewhere. And if it's chock full of proteins, you could be pregnant or working out too hard or have high blood pressure or be headed to heart failure. So So as you can see, even if the most thought you've given to the subject is to wonder if you should pee now or wait to the end of the movie, the whole process of producing, storing, and eliminating pee is nowhere near as simple as it may seem. From osmotic pressure to stretch receptors to hormones, our circulatory, nervous, and endocrine systems regulate how much urine we produce, what goes into it, and when to get rid of it. So join me as we journey into the world of pee. Wait, can we rephrase that? All right, how about let's look at where your pee comes from? No, actually, that doesn't sound good either. Let's begin by looking at what regulates the production of urine. That works. Last time we discussed how your kidneys filter your blood, but the actual production of urine can be affected by a whole host of factors. One thing that might have crossed your mind last time is the production of urine must, by its very nature, be influenced by blood, specifically its volume and its pressure. Because step one in pee making is the process of glomerular filtration, where blood is filtered in the little blood-filled balls of yarn that are the glomeruli. So just like water in a hose, higher pressure in the blood must push more plasma out of the capillaries and into the glomeruli. But here's a problem. Your kidneys can only handle so much filtrate at a time, so they have to maintain a constant rate of flow inside of them. This is known as the glomerular filtration rate, or how much blood passes through the glomeruli every minute. And your kidneys have ways of regulating this rate despite changes in blood pressure. If your blood pressure happens to increase, for example, the higher pressure causes the arterioles leading to your glomeruli to stretch. And then the smooth muscle in the walls of the glomeruli respond to this stretching stimulus by constricting, automatically reducing the amount of blood flow into the glomeruli and leaving the flow rate relatively unchanged. This kind of intrinsic control or autoregulation is helpful in controlling the filtration rate through normal ranges of blood pressures, but the kidneys mostly regulate urine concentration at the other end of the nephron tubules. This kind of regulation I'm sure you're familiar with. If you've ever had too much coffee or gone on a bit of a bender, you may have experienced the pleasure of having to pee every 5 minutes. That's because your endocrine system has a lot to say about your bathroom breaks, so you have some strong hormonal mechanisms that affect when and how often you go. And as it happens, both caffeine and alcohol inhibit the release of one of these hormones, called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which is secreted by the posterior pituitary gland to help the body retain water and stay hydrated. How ADH works is kind of complex, but first let's remember that cell membranes are generally not that permeable to water, but in the parts of the nephron that reabsorb water, like the descending limb of the loop of Henle, water has to move easily through cells from the filtrate into the blood. This is possible because of special protein channels in the membranes called aquaporins that are both on the apical, or filtrate-facing side, and the basal, or capillary-facing side of the cells. By contrast, the cells lining the collecting duct only have aquaporins on the basal side, so not a lot of reabsorption takes place there usually. But ADH triggers those cells to move aquaporins they have in storage over to the apical side, which allows more water to leave the urine. And since caffeine and alcohol inhibit ADH, that means no moving aquaporins, which means very little water reabsorption and ultimately tons of peeing and dehydration. So yeah, lots of factors affect the production of urine. But once it's produced, it doesn't just leave the building. It has to be moved and stored until the time is right. Once the urine leaves the kidneys, it enters the ureters, a pair of slender tubes that drop down to the posterior urinary bladder. Contrary to what you might think, your ureters aren't just passive tubes, and your pee doesn't just wind up in the bladder because of gravity alone. Rather, like the small intestines, each ureter features a layer of smooth muscle that contracts to move urine using peristalsis. The frequency and strength of these peristaltic waves varies depending on how fast urine is being produced, and a series of valves prevent pee from backing up, making sure that instead it reaches the bladder. The bladder is a hollow, collapsible sac that temporarily stores urine. Like the kidneys, it's retroperitoneal, located posterior to the pubic bone and anterior to the rectum. The bladder wall consists of 3 layers: an inner mucosa surrounded by a thick muscular layer called the detrusor, wrapped in a fibrous protective outer membrane. The inner mucosal layer consists of transitional epithelium, which allows the bladder to expand so it can hold more urine, a handy feature for social mammals like us who prefer dry underwear and peeing in private. When it's empty, it collapses into a triangular shape, folding up on itself like a deflated balloon. Then, as urine accumulates, the bladder thins and expands into a pear shape, and all those folds disappear. A full bladder can comfortably hold around 500 milliliters of pee, though it can usually expand to hold a maximum of around 1 liter. At that point, though, you're pushing your luck, because prolonged overdistension could, in theory, lead to a burst bladder, although you would probably just just pee your pants first. But let's assume for the sake of polite conversation that you have found an appropriate location to relieve yourself. Your urine enters the thin but muscular urethra by passing through the internal urethral sphincter. Now, we don't actually have voluntary control over this particular sphincter, but the autonomic nervous system keeps it cinched up whenever you're not peeing to prevent leakage. Once the urine is through the sphincter, it heads down through the urogenital diaphragm, which includes the last stop, the external urethral sphincter, which is probably the one that you're familiar with because it's made of skeletal muscles and is the one that you control voluntarily. Only now are we finally ready to explore the act of micturition itself, the actual excretion of urine. Urination. As the pee from your morning coffee builds up, it causes the bladder to push out, activating the stretch receptors in its walls. The resulting nerve impulses zip along afferent fibers to the sacral region of the spinal cord, along interneurons and toward the brain, eventually exciting the parasympathetic neurons and inhibiting the sympathetic system. This tells the detrusor to contract while the internal urethral sphincter simultaneously opens and the external sphincter relaxes so that the pee can flow out. This, you may or may not recall, is kind of an acquired skill. When you're a baby, those stretch receptor impulses trigger a simple spinal reflex that coordinates this whole process, and you have no real control over when you pee. But within a couple of years of birth, your brain circuits have developed the ability to override simple reflexive urination and to choose a different neural pathway. So how's that possible? Well, an area of your brainstem called the pons contains two different centers that lock down your urination control, or lack of it. There's the pontine storage area, which inhibits urination, and the pontine micturition center, which gives it the green light. As your bladder fills up, impulses triggered by stretch receptors head to the pons and other higher brain centers that give you the conscious feeling that you have to pee. If your bladder isn't full and you're too busy to find a bathroom, it mostly activates the pontine storage area that keeps you from peeing by inhibiting your parasympathetic activity and increasing sympathetic output. Of course, the longer you hold it, the more your bladder fills up, and eventually the need to pee becomes too strong to ignore, at which point the pontine micturition center jumps into action, overriding the previous orders and opening the sphincter so you can finally tinkle. And that's how your own personal waterworks works, whether you're a baby in diapers, a grown-up science student, or a guy who was sent to leave a message on Jeffrey Lebowski's rug. Today, you learned how the urinary system regulates production of urine by maintaining a steady...
All right. So if you need to go back and watch those, they are embedded in the PowerPoint, so feel free. Otherwise, we're going to move on. So one of the more important parts of, or I guess, one of the most important functions of the renal system is the regulation of fluid balance. So the kidneys secrete renin in response to low blood flow to them, so hypotension, anything like that that can cause low blood flow to the kidneys will cause them to secrete renin. This renin joins with angiotensin in order to form angiotensin II. Probably sounds familiar, right? Angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE inhibitors, things like that. Okay, hopefully we're all on the same page. So this angiotensin II causes peripheral vasoconstriction, which results in more blood flow to the kidney. Angiotensin II also causes the release of aldosterone, again, should be another familiar term, from the adrenal glands, and this causes the kidneys to retain sodium and water and excrete potassium. This ultimately increases blood volume and increases blood pressure. So that is one way that the kidneys regulate not only fluid balance, but blood pressure as well. So the other way that the kidneys regulate fluid balance is through ADH, which is, of course, Krista just told you guys about, antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone is released from the pituitary gland, again, in response to low fluid volume. When circulating volume is adequate, ADH is really not released. Kidneys, this causes kidneys to hold on to water. This means that urine output decreases and blood pressure will increase. Antidiuretic hormone is released from the pituitary gland, again, when fluid volume is low. So long story short, this is really important not only to fluid balance, but also to blood pressure. That's what I want you guys to get out of this lecture, right? Pretty brief. That's pretty much the end of our A&P review. I told you it wasn't going to be too long, so hopefully it wasn't, and hopefully a lot of that stuff in the videos was a little bit familiar. So if not, hopefully you've got enough from 103 to carry you through for A&P. Otherwise, I really wouldn't get too bogged down with the A&P of things. As always, you need to have a basic understanding of anatomy and physiology so that you understand how pathophysiology can influence that particular body system and ultimately impact our patient, because that's really what we care about. And I will see you in our next video. Thank you.